So these are for specific items, and they have to be used during that fiscal year. So there's not necessarily a way to hold on to the funds to do something in the future. You really have to use them that year specifically. So there's a lot of information on the Ohio Department of Education if you're interested in looking at that more. But what we're going to jump into are those two largest items. So first is state funding. So we are what's called a guaranteed district. So in the state of Ohio, there's roughly 610 school districts. What happens is, from a state funding standpoint, you really want to be what's on the formula. So there is a formula for the state, but only about 100 school districts are on the formula. What you have is a guarantee, a formula, and then you have a cap. So there's districts on the cap guaranteed, about 500 districts are on either one of those. So the reality is they're not on a formula. A guaranteed or a capped district basically receives the same amount they received the year before. So as a guaranteed school district, we receive the same amount of money the year before as we did the year before as we did the year before. For us to get off of the guarantee, we would have to add roughly 250 kids to our enrollment. So just getting to a place where we might receive more money from the state is a costly proposition, if you will. So you can see here, this is our actual numbers. These are the last 5 fiscal years. State funding has increased in the district by an average of 0.37% annually over the last 5 years. The bottom line with that is the state of Ohio continues to put the burden to fund school districts on local communities. Again, this is a flat funded source of revenue. So now local funding. So again, that is currently 58% of total revenue. It is property taxes. School districts cannot utilize a sales tax. Income taxes can be used as an opportunity for school districts, but currently in Loveland, we have only property taxes. So the question oftentimes comes up, why levies? So first, as we already talked about, there's a lack of state funding. So that's flat funded, so we're not receiving anything more from the state. The second reason, and obviously the most important reason, is because of what's called House Bill 920. So House Bill 920 was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1976. And what it does is the school district does not receive any more money on voted tax levies on current property as home values increase. So that can often be a common misconception. For you personally, to see that, what you do is you look at your tax statement, you see something called a reduction factor, and that's taking into account your home increasing in value over time. So this is actually looking at our financials and showing the effect of House Bill 920. So district local property tax funding has decreased by an average of 0.12% in the last 4 years, while property values have actually increased by roughly 2.5%. You might ask, why the last 4 years? The reason why we have the last 4 years on there is because that's when the 2014 levy, the first year that it had full collections, was in fiscal year 16. So since we have full collections since the last levy, there's actually been a slight decrease. What you'll see here is this blip in fiscal year 18. That would be prepayments on property taxes due to tax law changes. So what you can actually see is some prepayments in 18, and in 19, the amount is actually lower than what was in fiscal year 17. But basically, this is showing you that as home values increase in value, the school district is not receiving any more money from local property taxes. Again, that is flat funded. So now when we just bundle it all together, so this is our operating revenue, so those would be those two pieces in general. Revenue in the last 4 years has averaged 0.60% annually over the last 4 years. So again, given the available funding resources in the school district, revenue is basically flat since the last levy. And if you do look, we'll talk about the forecast, but it's also forecasted to be flat going forward as well. So we're going to touch upon this a little bit more when we talk about the forecast, but this just gives you an idea of where our operating expenses go. So what you can see is roughly 83% of our operating expenses go towards salaries and benefits. So we're a people-heavy business, as we should be. But those are going to be naturally inflationary expenses with cost of living adjustments, negotiated agreements, and healthcare costs are typically rising. So now we're just going to go into a basic example of the operating levy cycle. So when we're talking about an operating levy, we're talking about our general fund. So there was a question about that. Our general fund is the primary source of funds that we utilize to fund the district. The district determines what is the lowest cash level that we can continue to operate. I wouldn't even say comfortably, that we can operate well. So that's a really important piece that we'll look at. And once the general fund runs low, a local levy passes to increase the balance, and this process repeats itself over time. So this is a general look at it as an example. So the green part is revenues, the red is expenses. What you'll see is, and we've already established that, I mean, this isn't far from what we're dealing with, is we've already established that our revenue is flat and our expenses are increasing. Is what you can see is your flat revenue, the green, and then where it pivots as your spending exceeds your revenue is a levy. So the point of a levy is to create some space, a little bit of a surplus, and then it slowly goes away. And basically what you're trying to do is create time and space to be able to fund the district. So it keeps going on. The thing that we're looking at right now is if this were the levy that just failed, basically this is being pushed out more. So the question comes up as to, if we're looking at an operating levy in March or November, why does that amount have to be larger? Well, we lost a year's worth of revenue, so the space has grown larger to try to make that. So that's just that's a general example of how the levy cycle works. If you're interested in looking at how Loveland kind of compares to some of our neighbors, just some more of this information, we'll have this up online, but it's buildingtagernation.org. If you go under finance, we have presentations from our finance committee when we started this whole process.
Kevin, can I ask who's on the finance committee?
Who's on the finance committee? Can I get you those names?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. So the 5-year forecast. So you all should have a 5-year forecast with you. I believe it's page, it's the second to last page if you look at the 5-year forecast. Does everybody have that? Well, I mean, do you have a 5-year forecast in here? Yeah, so there should be, in your packet, there should be a 5-year forecast. It's page 22. So this will give you far more information than we'll talk about here. So if you have some free time and want to look through it, this is a lot of the assumptions that are in the 5-year forecast. It's a lot of previous data as well. But we're just going to talk about some of the general information in the 5-year forecast. So the state of Ohio requires school districts to do a 5-year forecast. It's on your general fund, so it's on your main operating account. Despite the fact that we are required to do it, we use it as a living, breathing document. We budget out of it, we make decisions based on it, we look at it regularly. Even with that in mind, is what you have in front of you is slightly different than what you would see if you go to the Ohio Department of Education's website. Some budgets have been changed slightly, so this is a much more updated version of what's online. So again, we use it, it's living, it's breathing, we look at it regularly. So when you're looking at it, this actually is, I think it's on page 2, but when we're looking at the 5-year forecast, our cash reserves are declining due to flat revenue. So increasing expenses, flat revenue. In fiscal year 19, so if you're unfamiliar with our fiscal years, Our fiscal years are the opposite of a calendar year. Calendar year is January, December, obviously when they're telling that. July through June are fiscal years in the school district, so basically like a school year. So in fiscal year 19, which ended in June of 19, the district ran a deficit of $2.8 million. So again, when we were looking at that graph, we were below the expense line on the revenue portion. Currently, we're running a deficit of about $3.8 million for this fiscal year. So if you look at this, this is your actuals, and these are the projected numbers. As you can see, the cash reserves balance is slowly decreasing. Once it goes below zero, that means we do not have any money in the bank. So why is that important? One thing we want to look at here too as well is best practice would be 2 months worth of expenses in the district. 2 months worth of expenses in the district for $9 million. So what this is showing you is, this is actually last year's number, but this is for example purposes, is we typically receive our money, well, not typically, we always receive property tax revenue twice a year. It's not throughout the whole year. We typically, though, receive it in July and August. So what you see here is in July and August we received the money from property taxes, and then it slowly starts to be eaten away. And then at the beginning of the next year, January, February, it's always in these weird 3-month increments. But so you see a little bit of space, and then we start going down. Obviously, you see it below zero because last year we were running a deficit. But this is what we're looking at, is the concern with the school, and I would think of it even in my own personal life, is if I'm trying to stretch things, and my concern is 30 to 60 days, if some of these payments are delayed 30 to 60 days, we would find it challenging to make payroll. So that's why 9 months, or $9 million worth of expenses is a healthy cash balance to have, but I would say that would be bare minimum when we're looking at it.
I have another question.
Sure.
So in 2012, 13, and 14, your minimum was $9 million, but every year after that, it's been almost $10 million more than that. Why are you holding so much cash on hand if you only need $9 million?
Well, so if you're looking at our cash on hand at the end of the year, so when we're talking about minimums, so which years were there, those again, Juliet?
12, 13, and 14 was $9 million. 15 was 13, 16 was 16, 17 was 19, 18 was 22.
So what you had a little bit different there.
And it doesn't need to be exact, I'm just curious why such large discrepancies.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I wasn't here back then.
Yeah.
So I ran some reports just to look at generally what was going on, and I know when I mentioned it at your meeting was, my guess was that they actually had some potential revenue increases that were not necessarily based on property taxes. So like when you were forecasting out, they might have had some space that was being created. So if you look at 12 to 13, they had 5% increase in revenue and 3%, and then 15 is when some of the new levy would have come in. So if they were having increasing, they didn't really have that much increasing expenses. If they had slightly increasing expenses, they were able to make it up with some other revenue. Like right now, if we look at it from our perspective, is the 4% is a little bit skewed because of some extra money coming in, and we're looking at those property taxes being paid forward. Right now, I mean, this is how I look at it. So, I mean, this is probably an oversimplification of it, but in prior years, they had some revenue growth, so they had expenses increasing, but they had revenue potentially keeping up with it in those years. Right now, what we've got is we have a little bit of a different issue. Where now we have expense increasing, but our revenue is basically flat. So they probably saw something that they knew they would keep up with current expenses. I mean, I can't necessarily speak exactly for them.
Yeah, right.
But I just know that the current situation that we're in right now is our revenues are just not increasing, yet our expenses are. There's things that we can obviously do to look at that, but we cannot necessarily stop that they're going up, essentially.
Right.
I mean, that's what.
Well, I just think if you reduce cash on hand by $500,000 a year to get us back to the 9 million in 2012, 13, and 14, that reduces the amount you have to ask for in the operating line.
Yeah, but then you have an opposite issue. So cash on hand is not necessarily, people might look at it, it's not necessarily a savings account, it fuels everything that's happening in the district. So if you choose to not spend $500,000, we have to figure out a way to make a cut to not
No, you can,
spend.
I'm not saying don't spend it, I'm just saying spend it out of the cash on hand. I mean, right now you've got 19 million, and you used to only carry 9 million, so that's 10 million we've got as a buffer. Can't we use that instead of asking taxpayers to pay more?
Well, so, and we're gonna have more
Or am I not
conversations
good at
about.
understanding it right?
No. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities that we might have, but at the same time, the way I would look at it is we have to find an offsetting cost to do that. Because if this is a cycle that we're always looking at every 3, 4, 5 years, if I just spend more of that money, then the reality is that the levies are just going to get bigger over time. So we're going to have to find some sort of cost savings. If we don't want to spend $500,000, we need to find a cost savings of $500,000.
Kevin, you're saying that money, cash is allocated.
I mean, so that's what the forecast would allocate it essentially.
So you have the cash, but it's allocated to go somewhere against
Yes.
existing or future costs.
Exactly.
So if you cut 500,000, then you're short.
Of cash on hand.
But then you
And-
cut it from the
And
expenses.
the cash, you have to cover the
Balances.
expenses.
Yes.
So isn't it, Kevin, that you're saying at the beginning of this fiscal year for the operating account, we're at 15 million? We're projecting to go down to 11.2, 11.3 at the end of the year. If we took $500,000 of expenses out, that would go up to 11.8. But
It would
just
go down to 10.8.
10.8, yeah.
That's right.
What I would just say is,
So
just-
Kevin,
yeah,
just looking at this chart, we talk about 9 million cash balance, but this isn't showing cash balance. This is showing the difference between the income and expense by month.
Yes.
Yes.
And not
yeah.
anything to do with cash balance. So
Right.
it's a little bit confusing for me
Yeah.
initially, because I was looking at this saying, this doesn't register for all the numbers.
Sorry, yeah, so that's what you need to understand. So the intention wasn't to show cash balance, it was just to show when payments are coming in. So if we were a district that was 70% state funded, this would be far more flat because they paid out on a monthly basis. What I was just trying to show was why 2 months of expenses is a valuable number to be looking at, is because them delaying payment is not necessarily something that couldn't happen.
But to Lynn's point, June 19, right, where we show it's got a negative 2 million there, right?
Yes.
The end of 19 had a 15 million cash balance. So from a cash balance perspective, and when I was looking at prior years as well, June is a good proxy for your low point, because it's the end of your year, the new taxes haven't come in August, the new taxes haven't come in January, or have been spent from January. So June tends to be a fairly good proxy for the low point of the cash balance every year.
Yes.
So when I was looking at the cash balance then, June to June to June to June, those are the numbers that
And I'm not
Juliet
saying-
was referring
I mean, I
to.
understand what you guys are talking about. What I would just say is if you're trying to find, pulling $500,000 from cash on hand, I would say creates a separate issue, because it kind of starts snowballing over time, that if we want to create $500,000 in space, we'd have to find $500,000 of cuts.
Yeah.
I think a clear chart is actually the prior page, where you have the June cash balances over time declining because the expenses outweigh
That's future.
are higher than the income. Right, but I think what they're saying is because the expenses are higher than the income, that cash balance is expected to go negative around fiscal year 2022 sometime, and that's what's driving the need for the levy, because they run out of money at that point.
And I think a key point is it could be in December of that year that you're running out, just based on the cash flow at the beginning of the school year, and then declining and not popping up again until January.
Net income is not cash balance. They're related, but they're not the same thing. So he's saying we're running a negative, it's like you bring in 10,000 a month, but you're pushing out 12. It's not sustainable. That's all he's saying.
Right.
It's not rocket science.
All right, so we're going to dive, I'm sorry, any other questions? So we're going to dive directly into the expenses that you see on the forecast. So if you do go to that page 22, the expense part is the second portion, and if you go from top to bottom, that's what these expense line items are. So salaries is roughly 61.5% of the operating budget. What drives that? It's obviously our staff. There's negotiated agreements with our teaching, which is our certified staff, and our non-teaching staff, which is our classified staff. If you look at the assumptions that are currently in there, our certified staff, we're currently adding 2 teachers annually to improve student achievement. And the numbers that are driving it are 2% annual increases in base salary through the forecast, and a 2% annual increase in annual experience steps. If you're unfamiliar with schools, what the teachers, and almost everybody is on, is what's called a salary schedule. So every year that you have an extra year, you move up on that salary schedule. So that's what those experience steps are. So it's a combination of those two. If you go to the classified staff, again, it works the same way. It's 2.5% annual increases currently through fiscal year 21, and then 2% in base salary through the remaining years. Why that's important is because the negotiated agreement ends after fiscal year 21.
So the 2 teachers you're adding annually, roughly, what does a teacher cost? Let me just average, I'm not asking you exactly.
Yeah.
How much?
78 is the average level of teacher.
Yeah, so.
All in, including
No,
benefits?
No.
I don't need an exact number, just ballpark.
That's like 78 without benefits.
So a lower end teacher is roughly 81,000. A higher end teacher, all in, is roughly 117. That's
Including benefits.
That's including benefits. So that's using an estimate as to percentages for how many people were taking the family plan. And classified on their annual experience steps are 1%. If you go to the administrative staff, it's 2% annual increase in base salary and 1% experience increase. And if you go to the benefits side, so that's roughly 21% of our operating budget. 9% annual increases in healthcare are currently being put in from 21 to 24. Fiscal year 20 is 2.2%. That's an actual current number. The 9% matches our actuarial assumptions within our insurance consortium. One of the major risks that we run with that is many districts in the state of Ohio had an increase of 17 or 26% in fiscal year 20. I didn't say 17 to 26, it was 17 or 26% in fiscal year 20. So we were fortunate in that case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that could not happen in our particular case. So purchase services, so that's the third one down, is roughly 11% of our operating budget. The forecast has increases of 1 to 4%, depending on the specific line item. The largest pieces of purchase services are special education-related costs. So in fiscal year 19, that made up 45% of our purchase services.